She was invisible to her husband, until a message on her phone changed everything. Suddenly, the man who never paid attention started noticing every detail, every glance, every smile of hers. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what happens next will surprise you. The sound of the phone vibrating on the cold marble table echoed through the empty room like silent thunder, announcing the inevitable storm. Emily was in the kitchen, stirring coffee that steamed gently, while the aroma of cinnamon and fresh-baked croissants filled the air of that coastal morning. Her hands moved with mechanical gestures, learned during 3 years of routine that had slowly eroded the spontaneity that once defined her spirit. But it was James who saw it first. His fingers trembled as he held her device, as if the phone burned his skin. His eyes fixed on those words on the illuminated screen. "You brightened my day yesterday. I can hardly wait to see you again." It wasn't from him. It would never be from him. James's heart contracted with a violence he hadn't experienced in years, as if an invisible hand squeezed his chest until it robbed him of breath. The letters danced before his eyes, reorganizing into accusatory patterns that fed a dark fire inside him. For a moment, the entire world reduced to that screen, to that message containing more intimacy in one line than all the conversations they'd shared in months. During 3 years of marriage, Emily had transformed into an elegant shadow, inhabiting that modern house in the Hamptons with an ocean view she rarely had time to admire. The white linen curtains swayed with the breeze coming from the Atlantic, but she no longer felt the wind on her face. She had grown accustomed to the silence filling the spaces between them, that deafening silence of solitary dinners where the clink of silverware against Italian porcelain was the only sound breaking the glacial stillness. The silence of empty beds, with Egyptian cotton sheets that felt cold against her skin, even in the full heat of a Long Island summer. The silence of conversations that never happened, of questions she stopped asking because the answers were always the same. James had built an empire that touched the skies of America. Glass and steel towers grazing the clouds in Manhattan and Chicago, contracts moving millions throughout the country, meetings extending until the first lights of dawn painted the city's horizon pink. Emily understood. At first, she really understood. She saw the brightness in his eyes when he spoke of his projects, felt pride pulsing in her own chest when she watched him achieve the impossible, transforming blueprints into realities that redefined city skylines. But somewhere in that whirlwind of success and unbridled ambition, she ceased to exist for him. She became part of the refined decor, like the works by Jackson Pollock hanging on the white walls, silent witnesses to a life transpiring without true connection. Like the arrangements of white orchids, the housekeeper changed weekly, always perfect, always identical, as predictable as everything else in that museum house. The woman who once danced barefoot in Greenwich Village, feeling the hot pavement under her feet while jazz rhythms pulsed in her blood. The woman who painted the walls of their first apartment in Brooklyn with her own hands, staining herself with colors while they laughed and dreamed of the future. The woman who cried with laughter watching Woody Allen films on that worn couch they bought at a flea market, sharing popcorn and cheap wine that tasted like heaven. That woman had disappeared, evaporating like dew under the relentless sun of summer. In her place remained a polished and silent version who smiled politely at charity events in Central Park, posing for photographs alongside other wives of successful businessmen, all equally beautiful and empty. A woman who wore dresses by renowned American designers she'd never chosen, because James hired a personal stylist who took care of everything. Her closet was a catalogue of high fashion, but Emily couldn't remember the last time she dressed simply because she liked something. There was a precise moment 6 months ago when something inside her began to truly wither. It was their wedding anniversary. Emily had spent the entire afternoon preparing his favorite lobster bisque, using her grandmother's recipe from Maine that she kept as a sacred treasure, written on yellowed paper with the trembling handwriting of a woman no longer here. She lit candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls, chose Miles Davis music that filled the space with melodies speaking of passion and longing. She wore the navy dress he once said made her eyes shine like the sky over Cape Cod at sunset. But James arrived at 11 at night, exhausted, with loosened tie and reddened eyes from fatigue. He barely looked at the table set with lace tablecloths that had belonged to Emily's grandmother. "Forgive me." "Honey, complicated meeting. Let's celebrate this weekend." The words came out automatic, without weight, without truth. The weekend never came. The bisque cooled on the table, the delicate aroma of cream and lobster dissipating in the air conditioning. Emily took off the navy dress and hung it in the closet, where it would remain untouched, a silent witness to a broken promise. She cried that night, but without sound, because she had learned that her tears changed nothing. It was then that she saw the advertisement posted on a bulletin board in a Manhattan street during one of her solitary walks. Watercolor painting classes every Tuesday and Thursday, in a small studio in Soho. The place smelled of fresh paint and turpentine when she entered for the first time, with large windows letting afternoon light enter in golden beams illuminating the old hardwood floors. The exposed brick walls held decades of stories, paint stains of 1,000 different colors telling of generations of artists who had passed through. The wooden floor creaked softly under her nervous feet when she took that first step towards something that was only hers. The instructor was David, a middle-aged man with graying hair falling over his forehead and hands permanently stained with vibrant colors. There was genuine kindness in his brown eyes, an infinite patience that Emily hadn't experienced in years. "Art doesn't judge," he said in the first class, with a soft New England accent that reminded her of childhood in Connecticut. "It simply reveals who you are, without masks or pretense." His words touched something deep in Emily's chest, as if opening a door that had been locked for too long. For the first time in years, she felt she could breathe completely, expanding her lungs with air that wasn't loaded with expectations or disappointments. Because sometimes the greatest revolutions begin with the smallest gestures: an advertisement on a bulletin board, a door that opens, a brush that touches paper. The following weeks brought a subtle but undeniable change in Emily. Like desert flowers blooming after the first rain in years, something dormant inside her began to awaken. Colors returned to her life, not just in the canvases she painted with increasingly confident fingers, but in her soul that had been in grayscale for so long. Crimson red from the autumn leaves of New England she saw in childhood, sitting on her father's shoulders while they walked through Vermont forests. Cobalt blue from Cape Cod beaches of her youth, when she and her friends ran along the shores with no worries beyond the next ice cream cone. Golden yellow from Midwestern wheat fields, endless expanses bending in the wind as if praying to the infinite sky. Emily came home with paint stains on her hands, small constellations of color she refused to wash off immediately. They were badges of honor, tangible evidence that she had done something just for herself, something that filled a void she didn't even know existed. She smiled in a way James hadn't seen in months, perhaps years. A smile that reached her eyes, creating small wrinkles in the corners that spoke of genuine joy. But he didn't notice. He was too busy expanding the business to Boston and Miami, negotiating with investors on Wall Street, reviewing plans for a new residential complex in Brooklyn. They dined together only twice a week if they were lucky, and even then, James's phone buzzed constantly on the table, demanding his attention with an insistence Emily could never match. David praised her progress with sincerity that moved her to tears. "You have a natural gift for capturing emotions," he said, observing her brushstrokes that transformed Soho streets into worlds of palpable feelings. She painted Fifth Avenue in different moods, joyful under midday sun, melancholic under autumn rain, mysterious at dusk when building lights turned on like earthly stars. Emily felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. It wasn't just about the art, though, that was important. It was about someone who paid genuine attention, who asked questions about her life in Connecticut before marriage and really waited for the answers. Someone who cared when she shared that she missed the sound of church bells at dawn, or that her mother used to make apple pie that filled the house with an aroma meaning home. "Why did you stop painting?" David asked one day, while adjusting her easel so the light fell better on the canvas. Emily remained silent for a long moment, mixing blues on her palette. "I got married," she finally responded, and those two words contained universes of unspoken explanations. and somehow I stopped being myself in the process. Becoming the wife of someone successful requires sacrifices. Or so I believed. David nodded with understanding that needed no words. He had seen many women like Emily in his 40 years of teaching. Women who lost pieces of themselves in marriages that demanded more than they gave. Art has a way of reminding us who we are, he said gently. It's like a mirror reflecting our essential truth, the one we sometimes hide from the world and from ourselves. Then came that particular afternoon, 2 months after Emily began classes. They had been working on a challenging project, painting abstract emotions. David asked her to paint hope, and Emily found herself creating a sunrise over Manhattan rooftops, soft tones of pink and gold breaking through dark grey clouds. "It's beautiful," David commented, genuinely impressed. "It perfectly captures that moment of transformation when night yields to day. There's vulnerability in it, but also strength." Emily felt warmth spreading through her chest at the praise. It wasn't vanity. It was the recognition that something inside her still had value, could still create beauty. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling tears stinging her eyes. "I don't remember the last time someone really looked at something I made and saw it." David placed a paternal hand on her shoulder. "The world needs to see what you have inside, Emily. Don't let anyone convince you that your light doesn't matter." That night, when she returned to the Hamptons house, Emily found James in his private office, surrounded by documents and architectural plans. The blue light from his laptop illuminated his face from below, making him look older, more tired. For a moment, she felt a pang of compassion. He was also trapped, just in a different prison, that of his own unbridled ambition. "How was your day?" he asked mechanically, without lifting his eyes from the screen. "Fine," Emily responded, because she had learned that elaborating was useless. He wouldn't listen anyway. She stood in the doorway watching him, wondering when exactly they stopped being companions and became strangers sharing a roof. James finally looked up, noticing the paint stains on her fingers. "You should use gloves or something," he commented with a slight smile. "Those stains look hard to remove." Emily looked at her own hands, those small colored reminders she refused to eliminate. "I like them," she said simply. "They remind me I did something real today." There was a moment of confusion on James's face, as if he were trying to understand a foreign language. But then his phone rang, and the moment was lost. "Sorry, I have to take this. It's Boston." Emily nodded and climbed the stairs to her bedroom, feeling the familiar weight of loneliness settle on her shoulders like a too heavy cloak. She showered, letting the hot water wash away the paint stains, but not the memories of the day. In bed she read before sleeping, but her thoughts kept returning to the studio, to conversations with David, to the sensation of creating something with her own hands. Because the human heart is resilient, finding ways to flourish even in the most arid soil, seeking water wherever it can find it, even if not in the place where it expected. The transformation in Emily didn't go completely unnoticed. James, despite his constant distraction, began to notice small changes. The way she hummed songs while preparing coffee in the mornings, melodies by Norah Jones she hadn't listened to in years. How her eyes seemed brighter when she returned from classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, as if an internal switch turned on those specific days. The way she lingered in front of her paintings, hung in the small studio she'd set up in the guest room, observing them with a mixture of pride and wonder that he envied without fully understanding why. But instead of pleasing him, these changes awakened something dark in James, an insecurity he'd kept buried since his first marriage. When Laura had left him for a co-worker, shattering his confidence in human relationships, he had sworn then that he would never be vulnerable again, building walls of steel and concrete, not just in his buildings, but around his heart. He began arriving home earlier, not to spend quality time with Emily, but to observe her. He sat in the living room with his laptop, pretending to work, while actually monitoring her every movement. He noticed how much time she spent on the phone, who she talked to, how her face lit up when reading certain messages. It was a week after that conversation about the paint stains that James made the decision that would change everything. He hired a private investigator, a discreet man with an office in a midtown Manhattan building. specialized in matrimonial cases. He felt dirty doing it, as if betraying something sacred, but jealousy had taken deep root in his chest, poisoning every thought. "I want to know where she goes, who she talks to, what she does," he instructed the investigator, a 50-year-old man with an expressionless face who had seen too many human tragedies to be surprised by one more. "Everything." The investigator nodded, taking notes in a black notebook. "Do you suspect infidelity, Mr. Morrison?" James hesitated. Did he suspect? He actually had no evidence at all, just this corrosive feeling gnawing at his insides. "I just want to know the truth." Reports began arriving weekly, photographs of Emily entering the Soho studio, smiling as she greeted other students. Images of her and David conversing about paintings, their heads tilted together as he pointed out techniques on her canvas. Transcriptions of phone conversations, so innocent they were almost boring. Talks about brushes, types of paper, museum exhibitions she wanted to visit. But for a man consumed by jealousy, every image, every word transformed into evidence of something sinister. The way David touched her shoulder, even though it was a paternal gesture. The smile on Emily's face when she spoke with him, so different from the polite and empty smiles she gave James lately. The amount of time she spent in that studio, time she had once dedicated to being home waiting for him. James began checking Emily's phone while she slept. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the screen, using the code she'd never hidden from him because she had nothing to hide. He read every message, analyzed every word, searching for hidden meanings in completely mundane conversations about shading techniques and the price of good quality watercolor paper. The house, once a museum of silence, transformed into a prison of mistrust. The air itself seemed heavier, loaded with unformulated questions and unstated accusations. Emily felt it without fully understanding its origin. She noticed how James's eyes followed her when she crossed a room, how his jaw tensed when she mentioned art classes, how he interrogated her with apparently casual questions that had sharp edges. "How was class today?" he'd ask, but the tone carried a weight that wasn't there before. "Good. We worked on perspectives. I painted the view from Times Square," Emily would respond honestly, but she felt every word being examined, dissected, judged. "And your instructor? What does he think of your work?" "David says I'm progressing well. He suggested I try oils next time." The name David fell between them like a stone in still water, creating waves of tension that Emily didn't fully understand. Why did her instructor's name generate that look on James's face? That tension in his shoulders? One night, James accompanied her without warning. "Thought I'd pick you up after class," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Emily felt a silent alarm, but couldn't identify exactly what was wrong. They arrived at the Soho studio when class was ending. James observed from the door, watching Emily interact with other students, laughing at something David had said about the eternal battle between artists and proper perspective. He saw how David reviewed her work, pointing out areas that could improve with that infinite patience characterizing his teaching. And in that moment, James understood with painful clarity there was no deception, no betrayal. There was only a woman finding joy in something he didn't provide. And that somehow was worse than any infidelity, because it meant he had failed, not as a victim of her disloyalty, but as a companion, as a husband, as the man who once promised to make her happy. The empire he'd built with his own hands, the towers grazing the sky, the millions he moved with a signature. None of it mattered if he'd lost the only person who should truly matter. But instead of recognizing this truth, James allowed jealousy to deepen, because it's easier to blame others than face our own failures. It's simpler to build narratives of betrayal than admit we stopped paying attention, that we took for granted the love once freely given to us. Because the fear of losing can be more destructive than loss itself, transforming love into control and concern into prison. David noticed the growing sadness in Emily before she fully recognized it herself. Her paintings, once vibrant as autumn in New England with passionate reds and radiant yellows, began to darken. Heavy grays invaded her skies, opaque browns dominated her urban landscapes. The sunrises she painted no longer promised hope, but whispered of storms to come. "Are you okay, Emily?" he asked on a rainy Tuesday, as she mixed colors on her palette with mechanical movements lacking her usual enthusiasm. The rain beat against the large studio windows, creating a melancholic rhythm that seemed to synchronize with her mood. Emily looked up, surprised by the direct question. In her marriage, no one asked how she really was, expecting a true answer. Questions were courtesy formulas, empty rituals that didn't demand honesty. "I don't know," she finally admitted, feeling the weight of those words. Not knowing how she was perhaps more terrifying than being clearly unwell. It meant she'd lost touch with her own internal compass, that she no longer trusted her own perceptions of reality. David set aside the brush he was cleaning and sat on the stool beside her. "I've taught art for 40 years, he said with that soft voice that always calmed her. "And I've learned that paintings don't lie. They reveal what words cannot. And your paintings, Emily, are screaming pain." Tears sprang without warning, sliding down Emily's cheeks like rain on the windows. Years of repressed feelings found escape in that moment, in the safety of a studio that smelled of turpentine and understanding. "My marriage is dying," she whispered, "and I don't know how to save it. I don't know if I still want to save it." David offered a tissue, giving her space to cry without interruption. When the tears finally calmed, he spoke with wisdom gained through decades of observing human lives unfold. "Sometimes things need to fall completely apart before we can rebuild them into something better. Or sometimes we recognize that some buildings can't be saved, only demolished to make space for something new." That night after class, David sent that fatal message. It was a gesture of kindness, nothing more. "You brightened my day yesterday. I can hardly wait to see you again." He meant that her presence in the studio brought positive energy, that her artistic progress was inspiring, that he valued having her as a student. But words without context, without tone of voice, without clear intention, could be interpreted in 1,000 different ways. And James interpreted them in the worst possible way. The next morning was when everything exploded. Emily was in the kitchen, not knowing her world was about to change irrevocably. James held her phone with trembling hands, reading and rereading that message, each reading adding more fuel to the fire of his anger and pain. He'd been awake all night after seeing the message appear at 11 p.m. All his surveillance, all his suspicions, seemed confirmed in those few words. It didn't matter that the investigator hadn't found evidence of a physical relationship. It didn't matter that all recorded conversations were completely appropriate. This message was the proof he needed that something was happening, something that justified the jealousy consuming him. But the truth was more complicated and simultaneously simpler. David was exactly what he seemed to be, an older teacher who appreciated his students and wanted to encourage them. His message had been poorly timed, perhaps too familiar in its wording, but completely innocent in its intention. James couldn't see that. His vision was clouded by years of buried insecurity, by the trauma of his first marriage, by the paralyzing fear of losing Emily the same way he lost Laura. The patterns repeated in his mind. A distant wife, interests outside marriage, happiness found with another man. It didn't matter that circumstances were completely different. For a mind consumed by fear, all roads lead to the same catastrophic ending. When Emily entered the living room with 2 cups of coffee, she found James standing by the window, his dark silhouette against the bright light of the Atlantic Ocean. There was something in his posture, in the tension of his shoulders, that made Emily stop short. "James, what's happening?" He turned slowly, and Emily saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. A volatile mixture of pain, fury, and something dangerously resembling desperation. He held her phone as if it were evidence in a trial. "Who is he?" The question came out as a growl, words loaded with weeks of surveillance, months of growing suspicion, years of unresolved fears. Emily blinked, genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" "David." He spat the name like it was poison. "Who the hell is David to you?" And in that moment, Emily understood. The constant surveillance, the loaded questions, the tension she'd been feeling like atmospheric pressure before a storm. James thought there was something more. He thought she was. "You read my messages?" Her voice came out calm, but something was breaking inside her. It wasn't anger, It was something deeper, the definitive rupture of trust, the recognition that her marriage was even more broken than she'd imagined. "Answer the question, Emily. Who is he?" The calm in her voice was more frightening than any scream could have been. "He's my art instructor, James. You know that perfectly well. I've told you dozens of times. And do your instructors always send you messages at 11 at night saying they can hardly wait to see you?" Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and threatening. The storm that had been forming for months was finally about to break, and they both knew it. There was no turning back from this moment. The words they were about to say couldn't be undone. The truths they were going to reveal would change everything. Emily placed the coffee cups on the table with hands that no longer trembled. She had found, in that moment of confrontation, a clarity that had been eluding her for years. "Yes, James. Some teachers care enough about their students to send encouraging messages. Some people notice when someone is sad and take the time to show they care. Some people pay attention. The storm was here. Because there are moments in every relationship where silence is no longer an option, where truths must be told no matter how painful they are, because the pain of honesty is preferable to the slow death of silent deception. The storm broke that night with a violence that shook the foundations of the Hamptons' house. Lightning cut through the dark sky like knives of light, illuminating the furious Atlantic crashing against the rocks, with a ferocity reflecting the chaos inside both of them. Rain beat against the glass windows with such intensity it seemed to want to break them, enter, witness the destruction occurring within. "Who is he really?" James's voice thundered louder than the storm, filling the room with a fury that had been accumulating for months. His fists were clenched at his sides, face reddened, veins in his neck pulsing visibly. Emily had never seen him like this, so completely out of control, so consumed by an emotion transforming him into a stranger. "I've told you." Emily felt her own voice rising for the first time in years, breaking the mold of the silent wife she'd been. "He's my instructor, James. Why is that so hard to understand? Why does it have to be something more?" "Because I see it in your eyes." James took a step toward her, not threatening but desperate. "The way they shine when you talk about those damn classes. The way you smile when you come back from there. You never smile at me like that. How do you expect me not to suspect?" And there was the truth, hanging in the air between them like smoke after a fire. The real accusation wasn't infidelity, it was the absence of joy in their relationship. It was the painful recognition that she found happiness elsewhere, with someone else, in a space from which he was completely excluded. Emily felt something breaking inside her, but it wasn't her heart. It was the chains she'd been wearing without realizing, the self-imposed limitations of being the perfect, silent, compliant wife. "And why do you think that is, James? Why do you think I find joy in a dusty Soho studio and not in this $3 million house?" He recoiled as if she'd physically struck him. I gave you everything. This house, the life you always dreamed of, financial security most people can only imagine." "I didn't ask for a museum," Emily finally shouted, releasing years of frustration. "I asked for a companion. I asked for someone who would have dinner with me more than twice a week. I asked for real conversations about something besides your construction projects and your endless meetings. I asked you to see me, James, but you were too busy building your empire to notice I was disappearing right in front of you." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of rain and distant thunder. James let himself fall onto the Italian leather sofa as if his legs could no longer support him. When he spoke, his voice came out broken, stripped of all previous fury. "Are you leaving me?" Emily stood still, feeling the weight of that question. Was she? 24 hours ago she would have said no, that she just needed a little space, a little air. But now, after discovering he'd been watching her, invading her privacy, building narratives of betrayal where there was only innocence. "You read my messages," she said softly, each word carefully placed. "How you violated my privacy. You spied on me. And instead of simply asking me, instead of trusting me after 3 years of marriage, you built this whole story in your head." "I had reasons," James began weakly. "What reasons?" "Because I smiled." Emily shook her head, feeling hot tears sliding down her cheeks. I was smiling because I was finally doing something that made me happy. I was smiling because someone, even if it's just my art instructor, noticed when I was sad and cared enough to ask why. I was smiling because in that studio, I'm not just James Morrison's wife, I'm Emily, just Emily, and it turns out I like being just Emily. James looked up, and Emily saw tears in his eyes for the first time in their marriage. "I didn't want to lose you," he whispered. "After Laura, I swore I'd never let anyone hurt me that way again. So I built these walls thinking they'd protect me, but the only thing they did was keep you out." It was the first time James really talked about his first marriage, about the pain he'd been carrying all these years. Emily felt a flash of compassion, understanding that his actions, though unforgivable, were born from old wounds that never healed. "Laura hurt you," Emily said softly, sitting in the chair across from him. "But I'm not Laura, James. I never was. And by treating me as if I were her, as if I were a potential threat that needed to be watched and controlled, you created exactly the situation you feared." "I know," he admitted, and those two words contained a world of regret. "God, Emily, I know, and I have no excuse. I hired an investigator, checked your phone, followed you. I did everything wrong because I was afraid to do the right thing, simply talk to you, trust you, be vulnerable with you." The confession hung between them like a fragile bridge over a deep abyss. Emily processed his words, feeling multiple emotions simultaneously: betrayal, understanding, pain, compassion. It was possible to feel all these things at once, she discovered. The human heart was larger and more complicated than she'd believed. "I need time," she finally said, her voice firm despite the tears. "I need space to think, to understand what I really want. I can't do that here, not with you constantly watching me, analyzing every movement, every word." "Are you leaving me?" James repeated the question, but this time there was acceptance in his tone, as if he already knew the answer. "I need to remember who I am without you," Emily said honestly. "For 3 years, I've been an extension of you, of your success, of your life. I need to find out if there's still an Emily outside this marriage, and if there is, I need to decide if she wants to continue in it." The storm outside began to calm, as if nature itself had been waiting for these truths to finally be said. The rain softened to a steady drizzle. Thunder moved away toward the horizon. Inside the house, the silence was different now, not the suffocating silence of things unsaid, but the expectant silence of an uncertain future. Emily stood and climbed the stairs to her bedroom. Each step felt lighter, as if she were leaving behind a weight she'd been carrying for too long. She opened the closet and pulled out a suitcase, beginning to fill it methodically. Practical clothes, her favorite brushes, the notebook where she sketched ideas for future paintings. James appeared in the doorway, watching but not trying to stop her. "Where will you go?" "There's a small apartment near the studio," Emily responded. "I saw it a few weeks ago, just out of curiosity. Tomorrow I'll call the landlord. Let me at least help financially." "No," Emily interrupted him firmly, but without cruelty. "I have my own savings, not much but enough. I need to do this alone, James, completely alone." He nodded, understanding he'd lost the right to help, to protect, to control. "Is there any chance?" He left the question unfinished, too afraid to hear the answer. Emily stopped, a blouse half folded in her hands. "I don't know," she admitted with brutal honesty. "Right now, I don't know. And I think that's exactly why I need to go. Because if I stay here, I'll make decisions based on comfort, on fear, on guilt. And I deserve more than that. We both deserve more than that." She left the packed suitcase by the door. In the morning, she'd call an Uber. But for now, she lay in the bed she'd shared with James for 3 years, feeling his absent presence in a way that was both painful and liberating. Because sometimes the greatest love we can show is letting go, giving space, allowing someone to find their own path, even if that path leads them away from us. The apartment in Brooklyn was tiny compared to the Hamptons house, a fraction of the size, with walls that needed a coat of paint and hardwood floors that creaked with every step. But when Emily opened the windows for the first time, allowing fresh New York air to enter, along with the distant sound of traffic and conversations from the street below, She felt something she hadn't experienced in years, pure and unadulterated freedom. There was no designer furniture here, no art worth more than a small car hanging on the walls. There was only blank space, a canvas waiting to be filled with her choices, with her own version of home. Afternoon sunlight entered through the old windows, creating golden patterns on the bare floor that danced when the cheap curtains waved in the breeze. The first days were a strange mixture of euphoria and pain. Emily woke up disoriented, searching for the high ceilings and luxurious sheets of the house, only to find the lower ceiling of the apartment and a simple comforter from Target. But then she remembered, this was hers. Only hers, and the happiness of that truth outweighed any loss of material comfort. She bought a second-hand sofa at a Brooklyn flea market, the famous weekend market where vendors shouted their offers and the smell of fresh pretzels mixed with that of old books and antiques. It was a faded green sofa with cushions that had seen better days, but when she sat on it for the first time, drinking coffee from a $5 mug, Emily laughed. A real, deep laugh that came from somewhere so deep inside her, she'd forgotten it existed. The white walls became her personal gallery. She hung her own paintings, work she'd previously hidden in the house's studio because they seemed too simple, too emotional, too honest for the refined environment there. But here, in this small apartment, each painting told her story. The streets of New York in different seasons, each capturing a mood, a specific moment of her transformation. David visited a week after the move, bringing a potted plant as a housewarming gift. Basil, he explained, placing the aromatic plant on the small kitchen windowsill. To remind you that even in small spaces, beautiful things can grow. Emily made tea in her tiny kitchen, heating water in an old kettle she found at a thrift store. There was nothing elegant about this, no fine porcelain tea set, just two mismatched mugs and cookies from the grocery store. But sitting on her green sofa next to David, talking about art and life, while the afternoon sun turned her apartment to gold, Emily felt richer than she'd ever been in the house. "How are you feeling?" David asked with that direct gentleness characterizing every interaction with him. Emily considered the question honestly, taking her time to find the right words. "Terrified," she finally admitted, "but also alive. For the first time in years, I feel completely alive. Every decision I make here, from what color curtains to buy to what to eat for dinner, is mine. And that's terrifying because it means I'm responsible for my own happiness now. I can't blame anyone else if I fail. But it also means you can claim the credit when you succeed," David pointed out with a wise smile. "And you will, Emily, you already are." They talked for hours as shadows lengthened and the apartment filled with the soft light of late afternoon. David told her about his own life, about a marriage that ended decades ago, not through drama but through the simple recognition that two people can love each other and still not be right for each other. "Love isn't always enough," he said thoughtfully. "Sometimes you need compatibility, communication, the mutual desire to grow together. And if those things aren't there, love just becomes a beautiful prison." His words resonated deeply with Emily. It was exactly what she'd experienced with James, love that became obligation, passion that cooled into routine, a connection that withered under the weight of unmet expectations and unshared dreams. That night, after David left, Emily stood on her small balcony, watching New York lights twinkling like earthly stars. The noise of the city surrounded her, conversations of people walking in the streets below, music from a nearby bar, the occasional motorcycle roaring past. It was chaotic, imperfect, noisy. It was perfect. She took out her phone and, for the first time in weeks, looked at James's messages. There were dozens, at first angry and accusatory, then pleading, and finally, in the most recent ones, simply sad. "I miss you," was all the last one said. Emily wrote a response, deleting it, writing another, deleting again. Finally, she wrote, "I miss you too, but missing isn't enough." She pressed send before she could regret it. Her phone rang immediately. It was James. Emily contemplated letting it ring, but something in her needed this conversation. "Hello?" "Emily." His voice sounded hoarse, as if he'd been drinking or crying or both. "Can we talk? Really talk, not just send messages that disappear into the air." "We're talking now," she said softly. "I mean in person. Coffee somewhere neutral. No pressure, no expectations, just let me see you, please." Emily hesitated, feeling the pull of shared history, of 3 years of intertwined life. But she also felt the fragility of her new independence, like a young plant that could be easily crushed if not protected. "I'm not ready," she admitted. "I still need time, James." There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, "How much time?" "I don't know. I can't give you a deadline or timeline. This isn't a construction project you can plan with precision. It's my life, my heart, my future, and I need to understand it before I can make any decisions. Is there any chance we'll get back together?" His voice broke, asking the question. Emily closed her eyes, feeling hot tears sliding down her cheeks. "I don't know," she whispered honestly. "Right now I honestly don't know, and I think that uncertainty is exactly why I need this time." After hanging up, Emily allowed herself to cry completely for the first time since leaving the house. She cried for the marriage she thought they'd have, for dreams that didn't come true, for the man James could have been if his own demons hadn't consumed him. But she also cried with relief for finally finding the strength to choose herself, to leave a situation that was slowly killing her. Because freedom never comes without pain, without mourning what we leave behind. But that pain is the price of authenticity, and it's a price worth paying. The weeks in Brooklyn turned into a month, then 2. Emily established new routines that were completely hers. Coffee at the small corner cafe where the barista learned her name and order. Long walks through Central Park, where she watched families feed ducks and elderly people play chess under trees. Afternoons at the studio, where her paintings grew bolder, more honest, more truly hers. It was during one of these ordinary days that the extraordinary happened. Emily was in a small gallery in Soho contemplating an exhibition of contemporary American art, when a familiar voice called her. "Emily?" She turned to find Rebecca, an elegant woman in her 50s she'd briefly met at one of the countless corporate events she'd attended with James. Rebecca had been an architect at James's firm years ago, before establishing her own successful practice. "Rebecca, what a surprise!" Emily smiled genuinely, surprised by how much she'd missed simply talking with other women who understood the complexities of navigating the corporate world. They sat in a nearby cafe, one of those hidden places only locals knew, with walls covered in black and white photographs of 1970s New York. Over lattes and croissants, conversation flowed easily, moving from art to architecture to life in general. It was when Rebecca casually mentioned James that everything changed. "I heard you two separated," she said delicately. "I'm sorry if it's something difficult for you." Emily nodded, stirring her coffee, though it no longer needed stirring. "It's complicated. Everything in my marriage has been complicated lately." Rebecca remained silent for a moment, as if debating something internally. Finally, she spoke. "Did James ever tell you about his first marriage?" The question caught Emily off guard. "He mentioned he was married before, that his ex-wife left him for another man, but he never wanted to talk about it in detail." "There's more to that story," Rebecca said carefully, measuring her words. "I was working at his firm when it all happened. I saw how it affected him, how he changed afterward." Emily leaned forward, suddenly eager to understand. "What really happened?" Rebecca sighed, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. "Laura, his first wife, was amazing, brilliant, successful, full of life. But James, even then, was obsessed with work. She tried, Emily, she really tried to make it work. But he neglected her the same way. Well, the same way I imagine he neglected you." The words fell like stones in still water. "So she didn't just leave him capriciously?" "No." Rebecca shook her head firmly. "Laura asked for couples therapy. She begged him to work less, spend time with her. But James was building his empire and nothing else mattered. When she met someone who listened to her, who really saw her, yes, she left James. But it wasn't a betrayal out of nowhere. It was the result of years of being ignored." Emily felt her understanding of James's past reorganizing. He'd painted himself as the victim, the man betrayed by an unfaithful wife. But the truth was more nuanced. It was a pattern, a story he'd repeated with her, a cycle he'd never broken because he'd never faced his own responsibility in its failure. After Laura left, Rebecca continued, James built these massive walls. He swore he'd never let anyone hurt him again. So he dove even deeper into work, into success, into creating an empire so big he'd never feel vulnerable again. But what he really created, Emily said slowly, understanding, was a prison, for himself and for anyone who tried to love him. Rebecca nodded sadly. It's a tragedy, really, because James is capable of so much love. I saw glimpses of it when you two met. The way he looked at you then was different from how he looked at Laura in the last days of their marriage. I thought maybe, with the right person, he could finally change. But the right person can't fix someone who isn't willing to fix themselves, Emily said, the words crystallizing a truth she'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. They talked for over an hour, Rebecca sharing memories of working with James, watching his transformation from a passionate architect who loved his work to a workaholic who used success as armor. Emily shared her own experience, the years of slow fading, the gradual loss of herself in the shadow of his success. When they finally parted, with promises to keep in touch that both would try to keep, Emily walked back to her apartment with a new perspective. Rebecca's revelation didn't excuse James's actions, the surveillance, the mistrust, the years of neglect, but it explained them. It helped her understand that what she'd experienced wasn't about her being insufficient or not interesting enough. It was about a man so damaged by his own past that he couldn't escape his patterns even when he was destroying his present. That night, Emily sat on her green sofa, a blanket over her legs, looking at her paintings on the walls. She took out her sketchbook and began to write, not a letter to James, but a letter to herself. A letter about forgiving, not because someone deserves forgiveness, but because carrying anger is too heavy. A letter about understanding that some people are too broken to be in healthy relationships until they do the work to heal themselves. A letter about choosing herself, not selfishly, but in the way we all must, putting on our own oxygen mask first before we can help others. As she wrote, she felt something loosening in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying since she saw that message on her phone months ago. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not completely, but it was the beginning of understanding, and understanding is the first step toward healing. Because knowing the truth of why someone hurt us doesn't erase the pain, but it helps us see that the damage says more about them than about us. James's world began to crumble with the precision of a building being demolished, with controlled charges. First were the Boston investors, tired of unanswered calls and last-minute cancelled meetings. They closed the multi-million-dollar deal with a Chicago firm, a competitor James had publicly scorned years ago. The irony wasn't lost on American business circles. Then came the Miami contract, a luxury residential development project that was supposed to be his triumphant entry into the Florida market. The Miami partners, after 3 months of trying to coordinate with James, who was more concerned with hiring investigators and confronting his wife than reviewing plans, simply withdrew their offer. They announced it at a press conference, citing irreconcilable differences in project vision. Everyone in the industry knew it was code for "the CEO has lost his focus." The news spread through Manhattan like wildfire. Business blogs speculated, financial columns analyzed, and everywhere the question was the same. What happened to James Morrison, the man who built an empire from nothing? James watched his carefully constructed reputation eroding in real time. Phone calls that were once returned in minutes now went unanswered for days. Invitations to exclusive events that used to crowd his inbox stopped abruptly. The board of directors of his own company called him to an emergency meeting, where men in expensive suits and worried expressions delicately suggested that perhaps he needed to take time off, focus on personal matters. It was corporate exile, and James knew it. The company he built with his own hands, working 16-hour days for years, bleeding and sweating over every project, was now gently pushing him aside. His assistant, an efficient woman named Margaret, who'd been with him for 8 years, began filtering more and more decisions to his second-in-command. an ambitious architect from Boston who saw opportunity in James's fall. The Hamptons' house, once filled with the silence of Emily's absence, now filled with a different silence, that of complete solitude. James found himself waking at odd hours, unable to tell if it was morning or afternoon, the invariably bright Atlantic light offering no clues. He stopped showering regularly, stopped shaving, stopped caring when the housekeeper came or if she changed the white orchids that used to mark the passage of time. It was in this state that he finally confronted himself, really confronted himself, looking in the master bathroom mirror on a rainy afternoon. The man looking back was a stranger, sunken eyes with dark circles underneath, unshaven cheeks, uncombed hair. But what shocked him most was the emptiness in those eyes, as if something essential inside him had been extinguished. When exactly did this happen? When did he become this hollow man who chased success with such fervor that he lost everything that truly mattered? He tried to trace the exact moment, but it blurred into years filled with contracts and constructions, meetings and more meetings, victories that tasted like ashes because there was no one to truly celebrate them with. He thought of Laura, his first wife, and for the first time in years, really thought of her without the self-imposed victim layer he'd built. Rebecca was right when she told Emily the truth. Laura hadn't betrayed him capriciously. She'd asked for help, begged for attention, fought for their marriage while he was too busy fighting for the next big project. And then Emily. Sweet Emily, who loved him with a purity he didn't deserve, who tried to reach him through the walls he'd built, who slowly withered under his neglect until she had no choice but to seek life elsewhere. Not in another man's arms, as his paranoid jealousy convinced him, but simply in a space where she could breathe, create, exist as something more than a decorative accessory in his meticulously curated life. The truth crushed him with the weight of years of denial. He wasn't the victim in any of these stories. He was the architect of his own destruction, building walls so high and thick that no one could scale them, not even the people he loved, especially the people he loved. James slid down the cold bathroom tile until he sat on the floor, his back against the marble bathtub that Emily had once loved, where she used to take long baths with soft music and scented candles before even that became something she stopped doing. He cried then, tears that had been accumulating for decades, since the day Laura left, perhaps since even before, since his own childhood when he learned that success was safer than vulnerability. That achievement was more reliable than love. He didn't know how long he sat there, but when he finally stood, his legs numb and the sunset painting the bathroom orange, he felt something different. Not better, not fixed, but different. As if something hermetically sealed inside him had finally cracked, allowing the infection to drain. That night, James did something he hadn't done in years. He called a therapist. Not the kind of therapist who sees executives for performance optimization, but a real psychologist specializing in relational trauma. The conversation was brief, scheduling an appointment for the following week, but when he hung up, he felt the smallest flash of something that might be hope. He also wrote a letter to Emily. Not to send, at least not yet, but to organize his thoughts, to face his actions honestly. He wrote about his first marriage, about how the fear of Laura leaving had haunted him for years. He wrote about how that fear became a self-fulfilling prophecy, pushing Emily away by trying to hold her too close. He wrote about the private investigator, about checking her phone, about every invasion of privacy he justified to himself, but now saw as what they really were, violations of trust born from his own unhealed insecurities. He wrote until his hand hurt, until the pen ran out of ink, until the first lights of dawn began to tinge the sky pink over the Atlantic. And when he finished, when he set down the pen and looked at the pages filled with his honest confession, he felt a little lighter. Not forgiven because forgiveness had to come from Emily, but at least honest. Finally, after years of self-deception, brutally honest with himself. Because hitting bottom isn't always the end. Sometimes it's the place from which we can finally start climbing, when all illusions have been shattered and nothing remains except the naked truth of who we are. The therapy sessions were harder than James had anticipated. They weren't filled with comforting platitudes or easy validation. Dr. Mitchell, a 60-year-old man with reading glasses that constantly slipped down his nose, had a way of asking questions that systematically dismantled James's defenses. "Why do you think success became your complete identity?" "Doctor," Mitchell asked during their third session, leaning back in his leather chair in the quiet Upper West Side office. James had prepared an answer, something about ambition and entrepreneurial vision, but under the therapist's patient gaze, the prepared words crumbled. "Because it was easier to be successful than to be vulnerable," he finally admitted. "You can measure success. You have numbers, contracts, buildings that prove your worth. But love relationships, they're messy, unpredictable. You can do everything right and still fail. Or you can do everything wrong and still be loved," Dr. Mitchell suggested gently. "That's the real fear, isn't it? That you could be loved not for your achievements but simply for who you are. And that's terrifying because it means you're enough as you are, without armor, without achievements to protect you." The words hit James like a physical punch. For weeks afterward, they continued resonating in his mind, waking him in the middle of the night, whispering during rare moments of stillness. Meanwhile, his professional life continued unraveling. The board formally voted to place him on extended leave, a corporate euphemism for being stripped of power, without the public scandal of an outright firing. A carefully worded press release mentioned his desire to focus on family, without noting that his family consisted of an empty house and a broken marriage. Architecture media speculated endlessly. Some blamed overexpansion, others the recent pandemic that had shaken real estate markets. But those inside the industry knew the truth. James Morrison had lost his focus, and in his business, lack of focus was fatal. There was one particular meeting that stayed with James. His ex-partner, Michael, a man with whom he'd built the business in the early days when they were just two young architects with big dreams and minimal resources, invited him to lunch at a discreet restaurant near Madison Square Park. "You look terrible," Michael said bluntly when James arrived, his suit wrinkled and tie slightly crooked. It was so different from the meticulously groomed James, everyone knew that it was shocking. "Thanks for noticing," James responded with bitter humor, ordering a bourbon despite it being barely noon. Michael waited until the waitress left before continuing. "What happened to you, Jamie? The man I knew was passionate, yes, but also human. He knew when to step back, when to live. When did you stop living?" James took a long sip of his drink, feeling the liquor burn his throat. "Remember when Laura left?" "Of course." "Everything changed after that," James said, his words heavy. "I decided I'd never be hurt that way again. So I built walls, Michael. Walls around my heart, my time, my life. I thought I was protecting myself. But what I really did was build a prison." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "And Emily couldn't live in that prison." "No one could," James admitted. "But I didn't see it, or didn't want to see it. I was so busy making sure I'd never be vulnerable again that I pushed her away with everything else." "Do you still love her?" The question was simple but devastatingly complex. "I love the idea of her," James said slowly, working through thoughts he was barely beginning to unpack in therapy. "I love the memories of who we were at the beginning, but I honestly don't know if I ever really knew her as a person, as Emily, not just as my wife. I was so wrapped up in my own vision of what our life should be that I never asked what she wanted." It was the most honest admission he'd made, and the weight of it settled on his shoulders. Michael reached across the table, placing a hand on his old friend's shoulder. "Then learn, Jamie. It's not too late to start asking questions. It might be too late for your marriage, I don't know. But it's not too late to become the kind of man who's willing to really know the person he loves." After lunch, James walked through Manhattan streets, deliberately getting lost in the maze of streets near the Lower East Side. He watched couples in cafes, families feeding pigeons in small parks, elderly people playing dominoes under trees that had witnessed generations of human lives unfolding. Everyone was living these ordinary lives, filled with ordinary connections. And James realized he'd spent so much time chasing the extraordinary that he'd forgotten the value of the ordinary. That afternoon, instead of sending the letter he'd written to Emily, he decided to do something different. He started a journal, not for her, but for himself. Each day he wrote about what he was learning in therapy, about childhood memories that were starting to resurface, about the patterns he was finally beginning to see. He wrote about his mother, a woman who loved conditionally, whose affection had to be earned through achievement. He wrote about his father, emotionally absent, who taught by example that work was the only thing that mattered. He wrote until his fingers ached, until words began to form patterns, until he could see how a boy became a man who confused love with achievement, intimacy with possession, care with control. Because true transformation begins not when we decide to change our actions, but when we finally dare to understand why we act as we do, excavating in the rocky soil of our past to find the roots of our present. Emily wasn't immune to her own process of reflection. While James faced his demons in the empty Hamptons house, she dealt with hers in the small Brooklyn apartment. The freedom she'd initially felt began to mix with more complicated questions about her own responsibility in the failure of her marriage. One afternoon, sitting in her art class while David demonstrated advanced watercolor techniques, Emily found herself distracted, her brush moving automatically while her mind wandered. Had she been completely passive in her marriage? Had she communicated her needs clearly, or did she simply expect James to guess them? When exactly did she stop fighting for her relationship and simply resign herself to her unhappiness? These questions haunted her as she walked back to her apartment through Brooklyn streets. She passed young couples laughing in bars, families dining in restaurants with open windows, a man playing guitar on a corner while his dog slept at his feet. Life, ordinary and extraordinary at once, happening around her. At home, Emily opened her laptop and began writing her own version of reflection. Not exactly a diary, but not a letter either. Just thoughts flowing freely about who she was before James, who she became during their marriage, and who she wanted to be now. She wrote about the girl from Connecticut who dreamed of being an artist, who painted into the early morning hours in a small apartment she shared with 3 friends. The woman who met James at an art exhibition and fell in love not just with his looks, but with his passion for creating, for building things that would change urban landscapes. She wrote about their early years together, when she painted on weekends while he drafted plans, when their creative worlds existed side by side in harmony. When did she stop painting regularly? Emily tried to remember the exact moment, but it got lost in a blur of moves to larger apartments, the wedding, the house. At some point, without really realizing what she was doing, she'd packed away her brushes, first temporarily during the move, then permanently when the studio in the house became James's home office. I stopped asking for space, she murmured to herself in her empty apartment. I stopped asserting myself. I became smaller and smaller until I almost disappeared. But it was more complicated than that too. She had enjoyed aspects of her life with James, the financial security that allowed her not to worry about rent or bills, the trips to Paris and Barcelona for architecture events, where she saw beautiful buildings and met interesting people. Even the house, with all its painful associations, was objectively beautiful. What she didn't enjoy was the loneliness, the constant feeling of waiting, of being a secondary, tertiary, 10th priority behind James's endless work. The gradual transformation from partner to accessory, from lover to household manager, from Emily to James Morrison's wife. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering. Hello? Emily, it's Rebecca. I hope you don't mind me calling. No, of course not. Is everything okay? There was a pause. I saw James yesterday. He came to my office, wanted to talk about many things, about you mainly. Emily's heart raced. Why are you telling me this? Because I think there are things you should know, not so you'll go back to him. That's entirely your decision, but because I believe in the full truth. Rebecca sighed audibly. He's going to therapy, Emily. Real therapy, not just executive coaching. And more than that, he's really doing the work. I asked him about the private investigator, about invading your privacy, expected him to get defensive. But he didn't. He took complete responsibility. Emily sat heavily on her green sofa. Why are you telling me this? Because for years I've seen men in this industry destroy their relationships and then blame their wives, the work, anything except themselves. But James, I don't know, there's something different this time. He's not asking for forgiveness or making grand promises. He's just... trying to understand how he became this person and how not to be anymore. After hanging up, Emily sat in silence for a long time. Part of her felt relief knowing James was seeking help, was facing his problems, but another part felt fear. What if he changed? What if he became the person she needed him to be 3 years ago? Should that matter now? David had once said that some things need to break completely before they can be rebuilt, but he'd also said that some buildings simply can't be saved. Which was her marriage. That night Emily painted. Not a scene of New York, not a sunrise full of hope. She painted 2 figures in a room, separated by space that felt both immense and impossible to cross. She wasn't sure what the painting represented, if it was the end of something or the beginning of a different conversation. She only knew she needed to get it out of her, give it shape and color and form. When she finished near dawn, she stood before the painting, observing it with critical eyes. It was her best work yet, technically skilled but also emotionally raw. The figures had no faces, could be anyone, everyone, every couple who'd faced the chasm between what they were and what they might be. David knocked on the door around noon, waking Emily, who'd fallen asleep on the sofa. He brought fresh bagels from the corner bakery and coffee in paper cups. "I was passing by," he lied kindly. "Thought you might need breakfast." As they ate, Emily told him about Rebecca's call, about James going to therapy, about her own reflections from the night before. David listened without interrupting, a gift he'd perfected during decades of teaching. "What do you think I should do?" Emily finally asked. David smiled gently. "I think that's the wrong question. The question isn't what you should do. It's what you want to do, who you want to be, what kind of life you want to build. And only you can answer that. Because in the end, no one else can live our life for us, make our decisions, carry the consequences of our choices. We can seek advice, seek wisdom in others, but the journey is ours to walk." 3 months after Emily left the house, James made the most difficult decision of his professional life. He formally resigned from his position as CEO of Morrison Architecture. He wasn't forced. It wasn't corporate exile. It was a conscious choice, communicated in an honest letter to the board where he admitted he'd lost his way, that he needed time to rebuild himself as a person before he could lead a company. The news caused shockwaves in the American business community. The Wall Street Journal published a speculative article. Business blogs explored, some with compassion, others with barely concealed delight at seeing a titan fall. But James, for the first time, didn't care. He was too busy doing the real work of transformation. He moved from the Hamptons house, a space too large and full of painful ghosts, to a modest apartment in Charleston. The historic city with its cobblestone streets and ancient history offered a perspective that the modernity of the Hamptons never could. He walked along the waterfront every morning before his therapy session, watching how light changed over colonial rooftops, learning to be present in simple moments. "Doctor," Mitchell constantly pushed him, challenging every rationalization, every excuse. "Why do you think you deserve Emily's forgiveness?" he asked during a particularly brutal session. James opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. After a long silence, "I don't deserve it. That's the point. Forgiveness isn't something you can earn like a contract or an award. It's a gift someone gives you. And the only reason she should ever consider giving it to me is if she can see I've truly changed, not just for her, but for myself." The therapist nodded with approval. That's progress. James began writing letters to Emily, but he didn't send them. Each explored a different aspect of their relationship, of his failures, of what he was learning. He wrote about the night he met her at that art gallery in Soho, how she stood before a Rothko painting, her face lit in the way some people are illuminated only when they're near something they deeply love. He wrote about their small wedding in Connecticut, in her family's backyard, with apple trees in bloom and acoustic guitars playing as they danced, how he'd promised to always put her first, honor her dreams as much as his own, how he'd broken that promise not dramatically but gradually, 1,000 small neglects that added up to years of disregard. He wrote about the forgotten anniversary, about the lobster bisque she prepared and he never ate, about all the art classes he could have attended with her but chose to work instead, about the conversations they could have had, the laughter they could have shared, the life they could have built if only he'd been present. And then, in his 10th unsent letter, he wrote about David. "I was jealous of the wrong man," he wrote with slightly trembling handwriting. "I should have been jealous of my own work, of my addiction to success, of the version of myself I chose to be. David only gave you what I should have given: attention, presence, the simple acknowledgement that you're a person with dreams and value beyond being my wife." One afternoon, 6 months after the separation, James did something completely out of character. He enrolled in a pottery class at a community studio in Charleston. Not because he wanted to be a potter, but because Dr. Mitchell suggested he needed to learn to create something without expectations of perfection or commercial success, just the act of making for the pleasure of making. He was terrible at it. His bowls were misshapen, his vases collapsed. But as his hands worked the wet clay on the spinning wheel, something in him began to loosen. The need for control, the obsession with perfect results, the fear of failure. Everything washed away in the clay staining his hands, in the imperfections he learned to accept. "They're not supposed to be perfect," said the instructor, an older man with rough hands and kind eyes. "They're supposed to be authentic. There's beauty in imperfection, in seeing the Creator's hand in the work." James thought of Emily. Of her paintings he used to find too emotional, too raw. He never understood that was exactly the point, the courage to create something imperfectly personal. He was finally starting to understand. Meanwhile, through the network of shared acquaintances, news of James's transformation began reaching Emily. Rebecca called occasionally with updates, careful not to pressure but feeling Emily deserved to know. Michael, James's partner, ran into her at a cafe in Manhattan and sat briefly to tell her that her ex-husband was a different man, unrecognizable in many good ways. Emily listened to these stories with mixed feelings. Part of her was genuinely happy that James was seeking help, doing the work. But another part resented that it had taken losing her for him to finally prioritize his emotional health. Where was this willingness to change when she begged for attention, when she cried alone in their shared bed, when she was slowly disappearing and he was too busy to notice? "It's normal to feel anger alongside relief," David assured her when she shared these conflicting thoughts during a class. "Both emotions are valid. He's doing the right thing now, but that doesn't erase that he didn't do it before when it mattered most." "So, what do I do with all of this?" Emily asked, frustration tinging her voice. "How am I supposed to feel knowing he's changing, but our marriage is still broken?" David thoughtfully cleaned his brush. "I think the question isn't how you should feel about his change. It's how you feel about your own change. You've been flourishing here, finding yourself, creating beautiful art, living authentically. Would his transformation add to yours or complicate it? Can you imagine a future with him that doesn't require you to go back to being the person you were?" These were questions Emily didn't have answers to yet. But the fact that she was starting to ask them, rather than simply reacting emotionally, felt like progress. Because growth doesn't happen in straight lines, but in spirals, visiting the same issues again and again, but from different angles each time, until finally, gradually, we find ourselves in a completely new place. It was Emily who finally contacted James, 7 months after leaving the house. The decision didn't come from a single moment of clarity, but from a slow accumulation of readiness. She sent a simple text: "Can we talk, in person?" The response came in minutes. "Yes, whenever and wherever you want, thank you." They met at a neutral cafe in Manhattan, halfway between Emily's Brooklyn apartment and the hotel where James stayed during his city visits. It was a Saturday afternoon, the place filled with weekend conversations and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Public enough to feel safe, noisy enough to have privacy within the crowd. Emily arrived first, choosing a table by the window where afternoon light fell softly. Her fingers drummed nervously on the wooden table, a rhythm matching her racing heart. When James entered, she almost didn't recognize him. He'd lost weight, but not unhealthily. He looked leaner, more defined, as if everything extra had been carved away, leaving something more essential. His hair was slightly longer, less meticulously styled. He wore jeans, a simple shirt, no sign of the designer suit that used to be his uniform, but more than the physical changes, it was something in his eyes. The hardness, The constant distance had softened. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," James said, sitting carefully, as if afraid to make sudden movements. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," Emily admitted honestly. "But I feel I owe you at least a conversation. A real one this time." They ordered coffee, simple rituals giving them something to do with their hands, a reason not to maintain constant eye contact. When the waitress left, a silence settled between them, not the uncomfortable kind, but the reflective kind where both searched for the right words. "You look good," James finally said. "Different. More alive." Emily nodded slowly. "I feel alive. For the first time in years, I feel like myself. And James paused, choosing words carefully. "I've been in therapy. Real therapy, not just executive coaching. Working through things I've been ignoring for decades. About my first marriage, about my mother, about why I build walls instead of bridges. Rebecca told me. Michael too. Seems your transformation is the talk of half of Manhattan." A small, sad smile touched James's lips. "I guess my public collapse has to have some upside. At least people are talking about mental health in business circles now." They drank their coffee, silence returning but more comfortable now. Emily studied his face, searching for signs of the man who'd loved her, the man who'd neglected her, trying to reconcile both with this person before her. "I want to apologize," James said, carefully placing his cup down. "Not with empty words or grand promises. I want you to truly understand that I see what I did, how I hurt you, how I created the situation I most feared. I'm listening." James took a deep breath. "I hired an investigator to spy on you. I read your private messages. I watched you like you were a criminal instead of my wife. Not because you'd done anything wrong, but because I was so consumed by fear of losing you that I created exactly the conditions that pushed you away." "Why didn't you trust me?" Emily's question was soft but cutting. "Because I didn't know how to trust anyone," James admitted. "After Laura, after years of seeing love as something dangerous, I built these defenses so high I didn't even let in the people I was trying to keep close. I had you by my side, but kept you at a distance, wanting your presence but not your intimacy, needing your love but not reciprocating it." Emily felt tears stinging her eyes. "I became a shadow in my own life, James. I stopped being Emily and became simply James Morrison's wife. And the worst part is, I let it happen. I didn't fight hard enough. I just shrank." "It's not your fault," James said firmly. "I created an environment where shrinking was the only safe option. Every time you tried to reach me, I was in a meeting, on a flight, too tired, too busy. I trained you to stop trying." They talked for hours as the sun set outside, as the cafe filled and emptied of other customers, as their own cups were refilled repeatedly. They talked about things they'd never discussed in 3 years of marriage: his family, her insecurities, dreams they'd abandoned, hopes they never shared. James told her about his mother, a woman whose love was conditional based on achievements, how he learned early that being enough meant doing more, achieving more, earning more. Emily shared about her father, who died when she was young, leaving her with a persistent fear of abandonment she'd never fully processed. "We brought all this baggage to our marriage," Emily said thoughtfully, "and never unpacked it together. We just piled it in the corner and pretended it wasn't there, and then wondered why we kept tripping over it," James completed. When they finally stood to leave, the cafe was closing, staff gently cleaning around them. Outside, Manhattan streets gleamed under streetlights, filled with weekend nightlife. "I don't know what happens next," Emily said honestly, standing on the sidewalk, "but I'm glad we talked. Really talked, maybe for the first time." "Can we do this again?" James asked hopefully. "I don't want to pressure you. I don't expect everything to go back to how it was. But can we keep having these conversations? Really getting to know each other this time, without the performances, without the roles we thought we had to play?" Emily considered this. There was risk there, the possibility of being hurt again. But there was also potential, the chance for something new built on more honest foundations. "Yes," she finally said, "we can talk, slowly, without expectations of where it leads." As they walked in opposite directions, Emily turned once to look back. James was doing the same. They waved at each other, a small acknowledgement that something had changed tonight, though neither knew exactly what. Because true endings are rare in life, and true beginnings even rarer. Most of the time we're somewhere in the middle, navigating uncertainty, taking small steps toward futures we can't fully see. The conversations continued in the following weeks. Coffees in different Manhattan neighborhoods, walks through Central Park, once even the MoMA where they'd had their first date years ago. With each meeting, layers peeled away, revealing people more complicated than the roles they'd played in their marriage. Emily learned about James's father, an architect who died in a construction site accident when James was 17. How that trauma shaped his obsession with safety, with control, with ensuring every detail was perfect so no one else got hurt. James learned about Emily's first love, an artist who disdained everything commercial, who made her feel guilty for wanting financial stability. How that shaped her relationship with money, her fear of seeming materialistic or superficial. "We're just humans," Emily said during one of their walks, watching ducks swimming in the park pond. "Carrying these wounds we thought we'd overcome, but that we'd really just buried. And then we wonder why our relationships feel like minefields," James added with sad humor, "because there literally are mines buried everywhere, waiting to be triggered." But progress wasn't linear. There was one particular afternoon, 3 months after their first coffee, when things almost completely fell apart. James casually mentioned he was considering going back to work, taking on a consulting role with his old firm. Emily's reaction was immediate and visceral. "Of course," she said with bitterness, "because you've really changed, right? A few months of therapy and you're ready to dive back into what destroyed our marriage." James recoiled as if struck. "That's not fair. I've been working on balance, on boundaries. It wouldn't be the same." "It's exactly fair," Emily interrupted, years of resentment bubbling to the surface. "You said you'd changed. You showed all this vulnerability, all this introspection. But at the first sign of normalcy, you're running back to your addiction." "It's not an addiction." James's voice rose, then consciously calmed. Or maybe it was. "But Emily, I can't just not work for the rest of my life. I need to find a way to be an architect without letting it consume everything." They were on Emily's small balcony, the city stretched below, witness to this moment of truth. Emily's eyes shone with unshed tears. "What if you can't? What if this version of you, the one who has time for coffees and walks and conversations, only exists because you're unemployed? What if as soon as you go back to work, you become that person again?" It was the fear that had been gnawing beneath all their conversations, the one neither had verbalized until now. The fear that James's change was temporary, situational, that it would disappear as soon as his life's conditions returned to normal. James sat heavily in the balcony chair, his face in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was muffled but clear. "I don't know. Honestly, I don't know if I can maintain this balance once I go back to work. But what's the alternative? Never work again? Prove I've changed by staying perpetually unemployed? I don't know," Emily admitted, her voice breaking. "But I'm scared, James. I'm scared that all of this, all our healing, all these conversations are just an interlude. And as soon as real life returns, we'll be in that same place. Only this time it'll hurt more because I thought things had changed." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of uncertainty pressing on them both. Finally, James stood and knelt beside Emily's chair, not romantically but in genuine vulnerability. "I can't promise I won't struggle. I probably will. There will probably be times when I get too absorbed in work, when I forget to call, when I lose balance. But I can promise you this. I won't be blind to it anymore. I won't rationalize anymore. Won't tell myself things are fine when they're not. And I give you permission, I beg you, to call me out when you see it happening." "What if I don't want to be your conscience keeper?" Emily asked softly. "What if I don't want to be the wife who constantly has to remind her husband to be present?" "Then you shouldn't be with me," James said with brutal honesty. "Because you're right. I have this thing in me, this drive that could consume everything if I'm not vigilant. And maybe that makes me unfit for marriage. Maybe some people are too damaged, too set in their patterns, to truly change." They were the most honest words he'd said, the acknowledgement that perhaps, despite all the therapy and self-reflection, he might not be capable of the kind of constant presence a healthy relationship requires. And in that acknowledgement, paradoxically, Emily saw real hope. "I don't think you're too damaged," she said after a long moment. "But I think you're right about one thing. I don't want to be your keeper. If we're going to get back together, it needs to be as equal partners, not as patient and therapist, not as addict and sponsor. Partners who support each other, who hold each other accountable, but who are ultimately each responsible for their own healing." "Is that possible?" James asked, and there was genuine vulnerability in the question. "After everything that happened, can we really be equal partners?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "But if we're going to try, it has to start with total honesty. No more pretending everything's fine. No more assuming we know what the other needs. Real communication, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable." They sat on that balcony late into the night, outlining what a reconciliation might look like. Not a return to the marriage they had, but the building of something completely new. They set boundaries, discussed expectations, identified warning signs they'd both need to watch for. "I need you to commit to ongoing therapy," Emily said. "Not just now, but always. This isn't something you fix and then stop." "Agreed. And I need you to commit to honest communication. No more shrinking, no more resentful silence. If something's wrong, you speak up." "Agreed." They established rules about work. No more than 50 hours a week. No answering emails after 8 p.m. At least 3 nights a week dedicated only to them. They might sound like corporate rules, but in their situation, they were lifelines. "What about the apartment?" James asked. "And the house? Where would we live?" "Neither," Emily said decisively. "We need something new, a space we choose together, that we design together. That's ours instead of yours or mine." As James left that night, there were no promises of reconciliation, no declarations of eternal love. There was only commitment to keep trying, to keep having these difficult conversations, to build something real on the rubble of what had collapsed. Because true love isn't the absence of conflict, but the willingness to work through it. Not perfection, but the commitment to keep showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. 8 months after that conversation on the balcony, Emily and James stood together before a small house in Charleston. It wasn't a modern Hamptons house with ocean views. It wasn't a tiny Brooklyn apartment with creaking floors. It was something in between, something they chose together after weeks of searching, discussions, compromises. The house was 18th century brick, with a tin roof and windows framing views of Charleston rooftops and the harbor beyond. There was a small garden where Emily already imagined planting jasmine and lavender, and a light-filled studio with north-facing windows where she could paint without harsh shadows. For James, there was a small office space, enough for drafting but not large enough to tempt long isolated retreats. "Are you sure?" James asked, as the realtor waited discreetly inside, papers ready to sign. Emily took his hand, intertwining fingers. "No. But I think certainty is overrated. I'm sure enough. Hopeful enough. And I think that's enough." They signed the papers that afternoon, becoming co-owners not just of a house but of a new possibility. The move took weeks, combining belongings from 2 separate lives into a single space. There were disagreements about decor, about which furniture to keep, about how to organize the kitchen. But they were normal disagreements, the kind couples have when they're building a life together instead of living parallel lives. James started his consulting work, advising architecture firms on specific projects without the burden of daily management. There were difficult days when the old impulse resurfaced, when he found himself wanting to micromanage, control, work late. But now he had tools to recognize these patterns. He'd call his therapist, talk with Emily, take a walk through Charleston's historic streets until the urgency passed. Emily continued her classes with David, but also began showing her work in small local galleries. Her emotional landscape paintings, as she called them, resonated with people who understood that places aren't just geography, but feelings made visible. She sold her first piece 3 months after moving to Charleston, a sunrise over rooftops capturing that moment when night yields to day, when darkness transforms into possibility. It wasn't easy. There were nights when old patterns resurfaced, when Emily felt the familiar pull to shrink and James felt the familiar pull to retreat into work. But now they talked about it. Sometimes the conversations were painful, tears spilled over the kitchen table at midnight, frustrations vocalized that in the past would have been left to fester. "I'm angry at you," Emily would say, and in the past it would have been an accusation. Now it was simply information, a feeling that needed to be acknowledged. "Thank you for telling me," James would respond. "Why? What did I do?" And they'd talk until they found the root of the problem, not always resolving it perfectly, but at least understanding, acknowledging, committing to do better. One Sunday afternoon, 6 months after moving to Charleston, David visited. Now in his 60s, with more grey in his hair but the same kind eyes, he walked through their small garden admiring the lavender Emily had planted. "They're growing well," he observed, gently touching the purple flowers. "They take time," Emily said, pouring lemonade made from their own lemon tree, "but they're worth the wait." David looked at James, who was inside making sandwiches, visible through the kitchen windows. And him? Also worth the wait? Emily considered the question honestly. "Some days, yes, some days I have doubts, but I think that's real, isn't it? True love isn't constant certainty. There's choosing to stay, to keep trying, even when it's hard." "And he also chooses you," David observed. "That's different from before." It was true. James showed up now in ways he never had before. He remembered when Emily had gallery showings, arriving early to help hang paintings. He cooked dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays when she had art classes, simple dishes but made with care. He asked about her day and really listened to the answers, asking follow-up questions, remembering details she shared days later. And Emily showed up for him in new ways too. When James struggled with a particularly challenging project, she didn't resent his preoccupation, but helped create space for it while maintaining boundaries. "Work in your office until 7, she'd say. "But then we close the door and the rest of the evening is ours." And he respected it, learning that work would expand to fill all space if he let it, but could also be contained in healthier compartments. Their first anniversary after reconciliation was simple. No grand romantic gestures, no reservations at expensive restaurants. They cooked together in their small kitchen, lobster bisque made with Emily's grandmother's recipe, the same one she'd made that anniversary night years ago. But this time, James was present. He chopped vegetables while Emily prepared the roux, their movements synchronized in a way that only comes from practice. They ate in their garden as the sun set over Charleston, painting the old buildings in shades of gold and pink. There were no speeches, no dramatic promises, just a simple toast to keep showing up. Months turned into a year, then 2. Life settled into rhythms that were ordinary in the best ways. Sundays at the farmer's market, choosing tomatoes together. Painting nights where James tried to learn watercolor, under Emily's patient guidance, his attempts clumsy but sincere. Sunset walks along the waterfront, not always talking, just existing side by side. There were setbacks, a particularly stressful project where James regressed to old patterns, working late, cancelling plans. Emily confronted it directly, and there was a big fight, the kind where they both yelled and cried and almost gave up. But they didn't give up. Instead, they returned to couples therapy together, something they'd been putting off, thinking they no longer needed it. "The work is never finished," said their couples therapist, a wise woman named Dr. Chen. "Growth isn't linear. There will be progress and setbacks. What matters is continuing to choose each other, continuing to do the work." And so they did, choosing each other day after day, not because it was easy, but because they decided it was worth the effort. Building a life that wasn't perfect but was authentic, that wasn't free of conflict but was full of honest communication. That didn't fulfill every fairy tale romance fantasy, but was deeply, completely real. On a spring afternoon, 3 years after Emily left the Hamptons house, she stood in her studio painting her most ambitious piece yet. It was large, 10 feet wide, showing a sunrise breaking over Charleston. But it wasn't just a literal representation. In the early light, shapes suggested 2 figures approaching after spending the night on opposite sides of a chasm. They weren't completely together yet, the space between them still visible, but they were moving toward each other, reaching out. James entered the studio, 2 cups of tea in his hands, stopping when he saw the painting. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Emily stepped back, critically evaluating her work. It's honest. I don't know if it's beautiful, but it's honest. That's the same thing, James said, offering a cup. Honesty is its own beauty. They stood side by side, watching the painting as afternoon light transformed the colors. In the comfortable silence between them were all the words they'd spoken, all the tears they'd shed, all the work they'd done. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, because real life doesn't have endings, only continuations. But it was something better, an honest beginning, an ongoing commitment, a choice they made each day to keep growing together instead of apart. Emily took James's hand and he squeezed back, a simple gesture containing worlds. Outside, church bells rang over historic Charleston, marking the hour, marking the passage of time, reminding them that each moment was an opportunity to choose love over fear, presence over absence, truth over convenience. And so they chose, day after day, building something beautiful not despite their imperfections, but through them, creating a love that wasn't perfect but was real, deep, enduring. Because in the end, true love isn't about finding the perfect person or being the perfect person. It's about finding someone with whom you're willing to do the difficult work of growing, changing, healing. It's about showing up day after day, choosing each other even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And in that choice, in that constant commitment to honesty and growth, is found something more valuable than any fairy tale. Real love, imperfect, beautiful in its authenticity.